So it's interesting to understand the process within that year, and it doesn't sound too dissimilar to how a business would operate throughout the course of the year, setting its goals for the next year and creating that budget to meet them. I think one of the things that maybe makes it a little bit different is, and it would be helpful for people to understand, is who's involved in the decision making process, because I think that's the other part of the black box. Everybody just assumes somehow, budget day, everything gets there, and the minister of finance has figured it all out, and that's it. But
Yeah.
that's clearly not the way it's done. So who's in the room? Who's actually helping guide that process?
I think it's important to distinguish that we're talking in all of this about the budget process, which is setting the direction about how we raise and how we allocate money, right?
Yeah.
But what that budget process doesn't do is actually how we spend money. That's a whole other separate process, and we can talk about that in a second. But I just want to emphasize that those are distinct things, because the people who are involved in one are not the same people who are involved in the other. So the people who are involved in the budget making process are, in both the provincial and the federal context. They vary a little bit the degree to which who has final say, but more or less the processes are the same federally and provincially. And they involve really two key decision makers. In the federal context, it's the prime minister and the finance minister. In the provincial context, it's the premier and the respective finance minister. And in all cases, the premier or the prime minister has the final prerogative of what we call funding authority, where if they have a disagreement with their finance minister, they have the prerogative to override the minister's decision and to say, well, maybe you don't want to fund it that way or to that degree. I, however, have a broader responsibility to the government, to the party, and to the caucus of our governing party, to think more broadly than just a finance minister. Because remember, the things that a finance minister largely has to worry about are not the same things that all their other colleagues have to worry about, right?
Right.
Finance minister has to ensure that there's some degree of credibility and prudence associated with their plan over a 1 to 3 to 5 year cycle. They've got to hopefully maintain that credibility with rating agencies, and we've seen a couple of provinces have their credit rating downgraded, and in Ontario's case, actually upgraded recently. And that has an effect, obviously, on the cost of borrowing if they're going to go into the market and borrow money. But they also have to manage the internal dynamics with their colleagues about, okay, maybe we're not going to invest in something today because it's not ready, or I can't deal with this priority right now because it's too big of a funding ask relative to what my fiscal objectives are.
Sure.
Right? And the prime minister may disagree with that assessment that the finance minister has made, because they may say, well, yes, I understand why you as the finance minister have to care about the fiscal framework, but at the end of the day, the government has a broader set of objectives. So it's effectively those two people ultimately individually making a decision or a call on each one of those 300 decisions that I mentioned. And underneath them are their respective political staff, who each give their own advice to their specific principles about each individual decision. And underneath them are the officials within the respective finance minister's office, finance department, or privy council or cabinet office, which supports the premier or the prime minister. And so if you think about a funding decision, you will have a request that comes in from an individual minister, let's say the Minister of Health. They ask for a series of things. Then that gets turned into a decision note that a public servant in the Department of Finance will generate, giving their analysis on that particular request and how it fits in the budget process objectives that have been set out initially. That goes up to a deputy minister, who then signs off on that advice. It goes to the finance minister's office, who gives their political advice on top of the public service advice. Then a decision is made by the minister, taking in both of those pieces of advice. And remember that as this process is unfolding, the minister who's requested that money, the health minister, for example, doesn't know about anything that's going on in this process. They've made their pitch, but they're just like a stakeholder, like anyone else. They're removed from this process. They don't get a say in this process, right? So they're like the Canadian Medical Association on the outside looking in. They've made their ask, and they're hoping that the process goes. And they may be exercising a degree of influence, trying to talk to people and encourage people and try to get people on side as part of coalition making. But even though they're in cabinet, they're not part of this decision. And so once the finance minister makes their decision, that gets transmitted over to PMO or the cabinet office. And then a similar process as happened on the finance side, as it goes through public service to political staff to principal, that same process happens simultaneously than on the premier's office or the prime minister's office side. And so you effectively have two decision makers with their individual sets of advisors providing input, but it's those key decision makers who get the call. It's not the other folks in the system. And so sometimes on budget day, when a decision gets announced, you also as much have to deal with the external stakeholders as the internal stakeholders, the people who asked for a bunch of things, didn't get what they wanted, and they may be just as cranky even though they're actually all on the same team.